we're happy to be holding this joint webinar with the League and GO-Biz. As some of you may be aware, GO-Biz has developed and published the Electric Vehicle Charging Station Permit Streamlining Map, which tracks whether jurisdictions are in compliance with AB 1236. And we encourage jurisdictions to check the map to ensure that it accurately represents your implementation of the law. AB 1236 passed in 2015 and required that all jurisdictions adopt an ordinance for an expedited streamlined permitting process for EV charging stations by 2017. And this webinar is intended to help jurisdictions better understand permit streamlining law requirements for electric vehicle charging stations. I'd also like to note that we expect additional legislation on this topic to move during the current legislative session. With that said, we hope that this webinar is informational, and now I'll turn it over to Ronnie of the League for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Marina. Good afternoon. As Marina mentioned, my name is Ronnie Verdugo. I am the Transportation Communications and Public Works Lobbyist and Federal Policy Liaison for the League of California Cities. The League represents 478 of the 482 cities in California. Really, more than anything else, thank you for tuning in. As usual, don't hesitate to contact us at the League directly if you have any questions. I know that GO-Biz will also share their contact info at the end, so please use them as a resource to figure out how to come into compliance with AB 1236 in the way that satisfies the statute. I really encourage the cities that have tuned in to be in close communication with both the League and GO-Biz as you look at AB 1236 and as you look to agendize these ordinances for your city councils to consider. We have invited, at least on our end, city managers, public works directors, mayors and council members, and building officials to tune in. So again, thank you, and we hope that you find value in this webinar that we're conducting with GO-Biz and with CSAC.
Thanks, Ronnie. Now we'll turn it over to Kylan and Tyson of GO-Biz for their presentation.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to CSAC and to the League and everybody who's tuning in today. We're really excited to be here. My name is Tyson Eckerly. I'm the Deputy Director for Zero Emission Vehicle Market Development at GO-Biz, affectionately named. And before we dive in, I just kind of talk about a little bit why we're here, right? And really the zero emission vehicles represent an opportunity to clean our air and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's an economic development story as well. And so that, just as we think of the broader context, that's really kind of what we're after, is trying to rapidly accelerate the market so that the zero emission vehicle becomes the first choice and eventually the only choice for private vehicle ownership and also for shared vehicles. And really when it comes down to it for zero emission vehicles, charging stations and hydrogen fueling stations are really the key that unlocks the market. That access to charging, it enables people to adopt, especially people who may not have charging at home. Right now we have about 700,000 zero emission vehicles on the road, about 50,000 chargers, and that's on the way to our target, 2025 target of 1.5 million zero emission vehicles and 250,000 chargers. So we're on the way, and that target gets ramped up by 2030 to 5 million vehicles. And so a lot of it is building up that infrastructure in advance. So there's really 3 levels of plug-in charging, right? And when we talk about plug-in charging today and not hydrogen fueling, the plug-in charging, you have the level 1, which is up to 1.9 kilowatts. It's basically any standard outlet at your house. That usually when you get a vehicle that comes with a plug that you can plug in anywhere. And this is really, 4 to 5 miles of charge per hour. So this is leave it charging overnight, leave it at the airport. Level 2 is more like kind of your standard dryer connection in a way. So that's about, 12 to 70 miles an hour, about 25 is what most people see at home. And those, if you install home charging, that would be level 2, but also in the public, these are places where people are going to be there for 2 hours or more, usually at a movie theater. And then finally, you have level 3, which is our direct current fast chargers. And those are, 50 to up to even 350 kilowatts. And those are relatively new to the market, the 350 version. But those are, 3 to 20 miles per minute. And that would be more kind of on a trip, So on the level 3 charging, we have a target of 10,000 direct current fast chargers by 2025 of that 250,000 target. And so to help lay the foundation and understanding, we've developed an electric vehicle charging station permitting guidebook with the following sections in it. We'll go in a brief overview, and then I'll hand it over to Kylan afterwards to talk about the actual streamlining in the map. You can see the sections here. We have planning and site selection, permitting, accessibility, connecting to the grid, and then finally construction, commissioning, and operations. So for the planning and site selection, there's a number of ways that local communities can help with the process. One of them is voluntary building codes. That's kind of one of the next things we'll be getting into. So they have building codes for new construction throughout California that has a minimum threshold requirement, but we've also within the California Green Code, we have the ability for jurisdictions to adopt more aggressive building standards to help make sure that when we're putting in new construction at the cheapest time to add charging and the infrastructure behind it, that it is done. There's also kind of the parking and charging clarification. So one of the issues that comes up at the local level with a lot of time is, how do we treat parking as it relates to charging? Unfortunately, this last year, AB 1100 was signed by Governor Newsom to help clarify that, and it clarifies that a charging spot is the same as a parking spot. So if you put in a charging station, you still get credit for the parking under local zoning. One of the things that some communities have done, if you look at the table here, is used planning as an opportunity to bring in more charging and to create an incentive. So if you look at like Sacramento County or the city of Stockton, if you put in an electric vehicle charging station, you would get credit under the zoning for 2 parking spaces. That's a way to help get more charging into the community. We've also seen, communities and encourage them to put EV charging into their climate action plans as a way to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions as a community. So really the heart of what we're talking about today is the permitting process. And so AB 1236 really streamlined the process in the following way. So the first thing is it requires a community to develop an ordinance, followed by a checklist that enables an online application. So that permit, with the ordinance and the checklist, once you follow that as a permit applicant, you submit your permit, and that is supposed to go straight to the building official for review. And that review is supposed to focus on health and safety only. What we're trying to do is minimize the rounds of comments, right? And so one of the things, if the building official reviews the project and see that there's a deficiency in the application, they would send that deficiency back to the applicant, and then the applicant will resubmit. What we're trying to avoid is multiple rounds of comments, right? And this is what AB 1236 is trying to avoid. So if X and Y were wrong with the application, we don't want to go back through that process and introduce Z at the next thing. And so what's noticeably absent from this diagram is the planning department, right? So a lot of times where a lot of the holdup has been in the past is with planning, right? With vegetation, with painting, all sorts of things. So it's really supposed to focus this review process just on building and health and safety. Within the guidebook, we put together, based on industry feedback and talking with local communities, kind of what is the best practice for permitting timelines. And so it's maybe a little hard to see on the slide, but from the time that, an application is submitted and getting a complete response back, the best thing we've seen is always going towards that same day. So some communities have implemented a same day process. You go to the building counter and get feedback that day. But if not, within best practices, a day or 5 days, depending on the application. When the complete package to approval to build is, within best practice, we're targeting 15 business days. So, about 3 weeks, and the optimal is always towards that same day if possible. And then finally, once the construction is complete and then to inspection, we're targeting 5 days. And of course, ideally, it's always working towards that same day. So we know that's very aggressive, and we also recognize there's a lot of competing priorities on permit officials' desks. And so we want to be mindful of that. But what we're trying to do is get as quickly as possible to the complete answer. One of the key areas that has been taking a lot of time is accessibility. So we have the federal ADA law has always required accessibility for any public space. And California became the first jurisdiction in the nation to provide ADA compliance guidance and specificity. The guidebook goes through, it does, probably 5 or 10 pages of the guidebook goes through and actually describes accessibility and what we hope is more accessible language, to use a phrase. But this table here kind of gives an overview, and our division of the state architect went through and developed these regulations, working with accessibility communities and charging station providers. And you can see as you get further and further down the list in terms of the number of charging spaces, the number of accessible chargers increases. So if you have 1 to 4 chargers at a facility, you would have to have 1 van accessible site, kind of looking at the table there, 1 van accessible charging space. But that van accessible space does not have to be reserved for an accessible parker. So anybody can use it, but usually you have signage up that will say use the space last. As you get into 5 to 25, that van accessible spot becomes signed, and then you add a standard accessible thing, which would be only a person with the accessibility placard would be able to charge at that charging station. And then as you go into 26 and to 50, you start to add the ambulatory spaces, which are just have enough space for an accessible, like for a wheelchair accessible car to use it, but doesn't have to be marked. There's been a lot of interpretation about the accessibility regulation locally, because ultimately it comes down to what the local building official determines is appropriate. But what we do want to stress is that if there is any issue at the local level in terms of how to interpret this and make sure that you're covering your city from a liability perspective, you can always reach out directly to the Division of the State Architect, and we have their contact in the guidebook as well, and they're happy to confer and help make sure that you have a credible code path to justify the project. We won't spend any time here today, but there's a section about connecting to the grid, which means a lot, especially for the charging companies who are putting this stuff in, because there's a lot of time associated with that. We have a section here on construction, commissioning, and operations, where the local jurisdiction will come in. Obviously is an inspection, but also the county weights and measures officials will ultimately be certifying that these stations meet, that a kilowatt hour dispensed is a kilowatt hour received. With that, I wanted to hand it over to my colleague Kylan Rathjen, and he'll talk about our mapping effort to help make sure that there is statewide compliance with AB 1236.
Great. Thanks so much, Tyson. So this is the moment you've all been waiting for. We're going to speak about our living version of our guidebook, the Electric Vehicle Charging Station Permit Streamlining Map. So we've created this GIS map on our website, which essentially evaluates every city and county in California, whether or not they've streamlined their permitting practices based off the requirements of AB 1236. Essentially, green means you've streamlined, yellow means you've complied with part of AB 1236, red means you have not gone ahead and streamlined permitting practices, and gray refers to we don't have enough information yet. But happy to report that by the end of the day, we'll have just about all of California graded on our map so you can see how you do in your particular community. So feel free to go to our website, go to business.ca.gov/ZevReadiness to see how your community is doing. You can click on any individual community and see the adoption date of an ordinance, whether a checklist has been created, and for the 7 different criteria we're looking at, whether or not your jurisdiction meets that particular set of AB 1236 information. So it's a fun map to play with, so feel free to check it out. So in terms of the jurisdictions we've graded so far in California, which is a large portion of the state, we have found that the majority of cities and counties have not complied with AB 1236. 52% have not even gone ahead to create a checklist or an ordinance. So clearly there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but there's also a lot of great opportunity to bring investment into your communities by streamlining the permitting practice. So you see 37 streamlined communities, 165 streamlined in progress communities, and 257 not streamlined communities. So there's some work to be done, but we can get there together as a state and as California. So why is this important, and why is this a priority for the new administration? The Rocky Mountain Institute has found that to install the chargers throughout California, it's 3 to 5 times the cost of the charger itself. That's a much higher ratio than other countries. So if we're trying to reach our clean air goals, we need to figure out a way to bring down the cost of installing this infrastructure. The same study also indicated that soft costs, specifically permitting, have the greatest possibility for cost reduction for charging infrastructure. So if we can fix this problem, it can really increase our deployment of zero-emission vehicles. And looking at the data from one of the largest charging station companies in the United States, Electrify America, they found that in California, it's a 70% increase in permitting timelines compared to other states. So it takes a lot longer to get your permit. Stations also need to be redesigned 30% more frequently in California, and it's 22% more expensive to build here. The big takeaway is that you want to do this because it creates new jobs in your community, economic development, and will facilitate the vehicles that will help clean your air and make California a better place for everyone. So what criteria are we looking at on our map here? So number one, the most important piece to complying with AB 1236 is passing a streamlining ordinance. Calbo and many cities throughout California have guidance documents created and previous examples of ordinances, which you can look to model your own ordinance. Secondly, you need a permitting checklist. This includes all of the requirements needed to get a permit for your particular community. Again, there's many examples online and on our website, but it should be based off the particular requirements of your community. Third, that there should be an administrative approval process for an EV infrastructure, and it should go through the building department. It shouldn't be, all throughout the different city departments. You shouldn't be focused on planning. It should be primarily done through the building department. And 4 is that the building department should focus it on health and safety review. So, aesthetics shouldn't be a concern here, parking counts. It should just be about health and safety. 5th, that there should be electronic signatures accepted for a permit, so that these charging companies, which are all throughout the United States, they don't necessarily need to have to send a person to the city hall to get a permit. They should be able to do it online. 6th is that a charging station shouldn't be subject to association approval. That means like a condo board shouldn't be able to shut down a project. Health and safety is being met, everything's being looked at in the proper way, then you should get your permit. 7th, which Tyson spoke about, is that there should be one complete deficiency notice. All the problems with an application should be bundled together, and applicant can then review that set of deficiency notice to see how they could fix it. And it may take a couple bites of the apple to address it all, but we're trying to avoid this idea of the city coming with 5 or 6 different comments and delaying the project substantially. Criteria number 8 is not required in AB 1236, but it's a best practice that Tyson spoke about before. We're trying to encourage cities to create timelines for getting a permit approved. If a city goes ahead and does that, we give you an 8th bonus point. If you get all the criteria, you're going to be considered a permit all-star on our map. So you definitely want to get that 8th point. So what are some common problems we hear from charging station companies? So number 1 is that aesthetics are a very large concern. Additional landscaping, having colored ballards, or having color of the charging station be changed for a particular application. Public art, we hear a lot of different requirements that cities have, and none of that is AB 1236 compliant, and it substantially delays the process of getting a permit and increases costs. There's zoning concerns. Tyson spoke about parking counts tend to be an issue. AB 1236 makes both of those not an issue. You should not be looking at those for getting a permit for a charger. And again, the electronic submittal is an issue we hear about, that charging station companies need to send out representatives to City Hall. So again, all these issues are not in compliance with AB 1236. We also see a large issue with different interpretations of the ADA. Local jurisdictions determine whether or not a charging station is ADA compliant. And again, we say speak to the Division of State Architect to develop code path which is legally defensible. Another large issue, which is why we're happy to talk to you all today, is that many cities and counties didn't even know about AB 1236 and that you needed to streamline your permitting practice. So we're here today to make sure that's not a problem anymore, and we can check one of these off our list so that you all know that this is a requirement that has been on the books for many years now. So again, this is an example of multiple rounds of problems for a charging station. You'll have an issue about ADA, you'll have building review comments, you'll have planning review comments, you'll have second, third round, all these issues are popping up, and it substantially delays the project. So this picture really creates an optimal situation where all of the issues are funneled through the building department. The building department tells you what needs to be fixed to get a permit, and then the charging station can respond to it quickly to speed up the process. So for many of the cities and counties in California that are green or yellow and red, how do you become green? So the first step is creating an ordinance. So again, there's many examples online on our website. You can look to those to create an ordinance. So once that's passed, you also need to develop a permitting checklist, which again includes all the requirements for a city or county. Many yellow jurisdictions have gone ahead and passed an ordinance, but they haven't gone through the extra step of creating a checklist and doing what's needed behind the counter to streamline in practice. So that's an important step to get from yellow to green. And then again, we're verifying what's publicly available in ordinance or a checklist, but we need to make sure that this practices are streamlined behind the counter, that it's actually being implemented in practice. And we're working with charging companies to make sure that even if you're green, you're actually streamlined. It's not just on paper, and we're making sure to check in with them as well so that the letter of the law is being met, but also the intent. And again, Tyson brought this up that we want to remove the planning department as much as possible from the process of getting a permit. Yeah, so that's essentially our presentation. If you're interested in learning more, GO-Biz is working with the Southern California Association of Governments on March 10th for an entire day dedicated towards funding information and permitting best practices for EV infrastructure, both plug-in and hydrogen. There's going to be a free lunch available if you're in town. We also have test drives available. We're going to have hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and a Tesla Model 3, which you can test drive. We will have in-person attendance and also online attendance. Thank you so much for listening to us here today. We're really excited to work with you all as we work to streamline California. My name's Kylan, and Tyson's here as well. Feel free to reach out to us. Bring your cities into compliance with AB 1236. And feel free to subscribe to our newsletter, The Plug and the Nozzle, to learn more about best practices and EV readiness with infrastructure throughout the state. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll now move into the question and answer portion of the webinar. We've had a few questions come in here. The first one is, where does GO-Biz get its information on whether jurisdictions are in compliance?
The primary resources we're looking at is publicly available documents. So that's an ordinance and a checklist. We can find that on the building department's website. We can find that in your municipal code or list of ordinances. So we're looking at that along with having online submittal available. Some of the other criteria, like one deficiency notice, many cities will say they do that, but they don't in practice. So we're working with charging station companies to get a better idea of whether or not different cities are meeting the law. But we're mostly looking at those two pieces of information, a checklist and an ordinance.
We want to make sure this is as collaborative as possible, so we don't have perfect information. So if you're a city or a county and have information that we haven't found, we would love to see it. Our favorite day is the day where we find stuff that, we turn a red community into a green community based on something we haven't found.
Great, thank you. For small cities that maybe don't have online permitting or electronic signature capability, how would you suggest that they come into compliance? Should they just reach out to you guys?
There's a exemption in AB 1236 about, if you don't have online submittal for any kind of permit, you're not required to have online submittal for an electric vehicle charging station permit. That needs to be specified in your ordinance. And, we give some flexibility to cities in situations like that, but because it may take multiple millions of dollars to develop an online submittal process. But if that capability exists in your city, it needs to also be applied to electric vehicle charging stations.
And just as a good example, too, for kind of a cheap way to do it, Tuolumne County sticks out as they used Adobe Acrobat and created fillable PDFs to do this. They didn't have an online portal, but they created one for this system. So that's another option as well. But if you notice on the checklist, there was an asterisk on point number 5. And that asterisk is about that exemption.
Thank you. How often will the permit streamlining map be updated?
It's updated on a daily basis. We're spending a lot of our resources here at GO-Biz to make sure this map is filled in all 540 jurisdictions. So if you send us an email or information, we'll make sure to get back to you within the day or a few days to change you on the map or provide you with information to become green or address any particular issues you might have.
Our goal for this year is to turn the whole state green. Maybe ambitious, but so if we can do that, get to that kind of posture, then hopefully you don't have to change the map again.
Is the permit streamlining for hydrogen charging stations the same as electric vehicle charging stations?
It is not. So actually we have a guidebook for hydrogen permitting that we published in 2015, and then we're about to do an update that should be out in the probably April to May time frame. But it is different. There's not the same AB 1236 streamlining requirements. So a hydrogen fueling station typically goes through the normal permit review process, which includes planning, building, electrical, zoning, all the pieces there.
Parking is a problem in their community, and they've included that removal of parking spaces for equipment requires design review. Is that in compliance?
That is not in compliance. So anything that's associated with a charging station is expected to be included in the project for AB 1236. So that's essentially where this happens most, I think, is in the DC fast charger area, where they have the switch gear and the supporting equipment may take up some parking spaces as well. But it's still covered by AB 1236.
The next question is from a city that doesn't have its own building department and contracts out with their county for building permits. Since you mentioned that you don't want planning review involved, do they need to adopt an ordinance when the county does all its building review, and are they in compliance?
If every component of a permit is done at the county level, then if the county is streamlined, then that particular community would be streamlined. So the grades would match up. But what we see in certain cases is that components of the permit review are done by the city and components are done by the county. So in that situation, then that particular city would need to either outsource everything to the county for EV permits, or would have to create some streamlined process internally based off AB 1236.
So in an ideal world, like if the city wanted to be in that process, you would intake the permit, check a box saying, yes, this is an EV charging station, and then send that permit application to the county for building review.
Thank you. Are you aware of any upcoming grant funding opportunities to encourage EV charging station installation? If so, what agency would that be with, and how soon would it be available?
biggest pot of money right now is with the Energy Commission, the California Energy Commission. They have the Cal EVIP program, which is the California Electric Vehicle Incentive Program.
Yes.
And so there, if you go to calevip.org, I believe it is, they have all the criteria there. Now, before you get too excited, it's going county by county. And actually, one of the scoring criteria in their next selection of communities happens to do with permit streamlining. So that if all else being equal, the county that has more streamlined permitting, that's where the funding would go to. There's also money through the utilities. So depending on which utilities are there, either investor-owned utilities or publicly owned utilities have funding as well.
What Tyson's saying, if you want to bring Cal EVIP to your county, make sure you streamline your permitting practices, because the Energy Commission will look at your application much more highly if you've complied with AB 1236.
Thank you. That was our last question. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope it's been informative. The slides are also available in the CSAC webinar library at www.counties.org. Thanks again.